so many of you have come. And I'm very sorry to announce that we're missing one speaker. Svetlana from the Kultur Institute unfortunately cannot make it tonight. But we're still hoping that Anna Shevchenko will come. And I hereby hand over to Lesia, our wonderful chair, who will introduce you to the speakers.
My name is Lesia Romanchuk. I teach here at CIS. Thank you, Platform Ukraine, for organizing this excellent and highly important workshop on identity. We'll focus on themes of identity, some broad themes in the post-Soviet space in general, but specifically on contemporary identity, sort of politics and discussions in Ukraine, more specifically. Now, the topic of identity will be approached today by looking at culture, literature, art, religion, and nationalism. So, a bit of everything for everyone here, I'm sure. And among other questions, the panel will discuss the impact of the recent Maidan protests on Ukrainian identity and the relationship between identity and conflict. And of course, it is really tempting to sort of, especially in the Ukrainian context, to separate the country and its population into sort of pro-Western West and pro-Russian East, and thereby slip into a kind of comfortable and very dichotomous, albeit inaccurate, but comfortable still framework, and simplify a very, very complex issue. I am absolutely sure that this is not going to happen tonight, mostly thanks to our speakers here. And I will introduce them right now. Well, actually, I'll introduce them one by one. Before I do so, let me just remind speakers they've got up to 15 minutes to speak, and afterwards we should have plenty of time for discussion. And our first speaker is Dr. Uyan Blacker, who is a lecturer in comparative Russian East European culture at the School of Slavonic and East European Studies, University College London. He has written extensively on culture in Poland, Russia, and Ukraine. He is a co-author of Remembering Katyn, a book that came out in 2012. He's a co-editor and co-author of Memory Theory in Eastern Europe, published in 2013. He's also translated a number of works by Ukrainian writers into English, and William is currently working on urban memory and the legacy of post-war displacement.
Thanks very much, Lisa, for the introduction, and thanks to Platform Ukraine for the invitation to speak again to your workshops. So I'm going to say, before I talk about identity as such, I want to say a few words about talking about identity. And when we talk about identity, how far talking about identity can actually get us in understanding the crisis in Ukraine and the conflict in Ukraine. Now, of course, it's important in the context of the protests last year. It's important in the context of conflict. Identity is important. In terms of understanding the roots of these things, the causes, I think it can only tell us so much. And I think it can even be somewhat misleading to focus too much on questions of identity. I'm sorry to kind of immediately undermine the theme of the workshop in this way. But I'll speak about identity properly in a minute. But as Alessia already alluded to, a lot of the discussion about the conflict, about the crisis, comes down to questions of identity. It comes down to people's political allegiances, to the languages they speak, to the kind of historical myths that they subscribe to, kind of historical memories that they have. And it's often, and there's this kind of dichotomous presentation of Ukraine as being split between a Western part and an Eastern part, a Ukrainian-speaking part and a Russian-speaking part, a pro-Russian part and a pro-European part, a nationalist part, and a kind of neo-Soviet or Soviet nostalgic part, and so on. And a massive oversimplification, which hides many sort of complexities and grey areas and areas of kind of overlap, and so on. But it is an easy way to explain conflict. It's a conflict. It's very easy to map it onto these kind of political, cultural, linguistic differences. It's seems to make sense. Yeah? What it ignores is, to what extent these things really are capable of sparking the kind of protests that we saw last year, and then causing the kind of conflict that we're seeing now, is extremely questionable, I think. If we take these kind of categories as somehow automatically leading to an undermining of the state, to the brink of conflict, into conflict, then pretty much every modern European state and beyond that we're probably on the brink of this kind of crisis. Yeah? In the sense of its cultural differences, its regional differences, the differences in political preferences of people in different parts of the country. Ukraine is pretty standard for a European country. You only have to look at the UK to see that people in the north of England vote very differently from the people in the south of England. There are very different identities, there are different historical memories in different parts of the UK. This is nothing unusual. Ukraine is not unusual in that sense. So how explaining why things have got to where they are now. Identity maybe tells you something about the background to this. It's something which is certainly instrumentalized in all this in many ways. It's not irrelevant, but it only gets you so far. In terms of actually understanding how you motivate people to come out onto the streets in these kind of numbers, and then how a conflict like this arises, it's, I think, far more instructive to look at the issues of corruption, the issues of the lack of the rule of law in Ukraine, especially under Yanukovych, the issues of under the Yanukovych government, but going basically back the entire period of Ukrainian independence, kind of abuse of the state by its political elites. And also, in terms of the conflict, the role of Russia in facilitating this conflict really cannot be underestimated. So that's my first kind of point about when we discuss identity, how much identity can tell us. But I do think that identity is very important, and I want to talk a little bit about perhaps some ways in which identity may have shifted in the context of the current crisis, some changes that might be taking place. A very good article published recently, Tatiana Zhuzhenko argued that Ukraine has seen, in some senses, deepening of divisions, particularly in the conflict-affected areas. So in those places which are experiencing the effects of the war, of the anti-terrorist operation, so-called, and very strongly influenced by the Russian media still in their perceptions of that, of the conflict. In those areas we're probably seeing a deepening of divides, a deepening perhaps of strengthening of divided identities. These are still relatively small areas, remember. What Zhuzhenko also argues, though, is that in the vast majority of the country, we've seen actually a kind of consolidation of identity, sort of rallying around an idea of Ukrainian statehood, a sort of sense of civic national identity, which is particularly strong, particularly noticeable in places like Dnipropetrovsk, in places like Odessa, so the kind of southeastern Russian-speaking regions, where we've seen things like the dismantling of Soviet-era monuments, a much greater kind of visibility of the symbols of the Ukrainian state in public space, opinion polls showing a kind of support for Ukraine's military actions in the east are actually seeing higher support in Dnipropetrovsk than in the Lviv region, for example. So there seems to have been this kind of consolidation, strengthening of a sense of civic Ukrainian identity around a kind of Maidan project. Something that the Maidan is seen in many different ways by different kinds of participants, but in the main it seems to have been seen as the revolution of dignity, so-called. Yeah, it's about things like fighting corruption. It's about improving the Ukrainian state in some way. And this is something, an idea that people, it's a simple idea that people can unite around. And this seems to have been happening. And in this sense, I mean, people made similar observations about the Orange Revolution. At the time of the Orange Revolution, there was talk about civic identity, the kind of emerging civic identity, civil society in Ukraine. With the Maidan, we've seen that to an even greater degree. The Orange Revolution was in many ways about political forces, about particular politicians. This one was not. Yeah. So this kind of civic identity, I think, has come through much more strongly in the recent protests. But this is civic identity. This is kind of it's crystallizing around perhaps political ideas, ideas to do connected with civil society, with rule of law and so on, which I've already mentioned. What about cultural identity? What about sort of national identity, ethnic identity, these kinds of identities? In this sense, I think there's a gap. There's something of a kind of gap between this sense of civic identity and the sort of, let's say, cultural identity based on history, based on literature, the kind of things that I'm interested in. In terms of education, in terms of general kind of cultural policy, throughout the post-independence governments, the tendency has been to focus on an ethnically Ukrainian-speaking sense of identity, which is not necessarily to do with a kind of nationalist redressing of the balance against what came before under the Soviet Union. In many ways, in fact, it's a continuation of the Soviet version of Ukrainianism, which was also very ethnically based, and also based on Ukrainian literature as well. It's quite complicated. But you still get that. It's still quite old-fashioned. It's still based in the kind of traditional canon of cultural figures. It's very much based in kind of folk culture. It's very rural-based. These things still persist. It's not something that can appeal widely to people who are not Ukrainian speakers, for example, who don't identify necessarily so much with this type of culture, of which there are many in Ukraine today. And in this sense, it's important to note that what we saw in the protest was a very diverse group of people coming together. So the Maidan was not made by Ukrainian speakers, it was made by Ukrainian and Russian speakers. It was made to a large extent by Kiev's middle classes, who are sort of a large degree Russian speakers. It was supported broadly by Ukraine's Jewish community and its Tatar community. And it's, some of its heroes, its kind of tragic heroes have been non-ethnic Ukrainians, Armenians, Belarusians, and so on. People who have been kind of accepted into the discourse as symbolizing. So to finish off, I want to kind of suggest three points that I think Ukraine probably won't do, but should do if they want to bridge this gap. The first is a greater recognition, through education, through the state's cultural policy, of the diverse cultural heritage of Ukraine. So, for example, looking at the diverse literary heritage of Ukraine, which is not just Shevchenko, it's not just Lysy Ukrainka, it's also Shalom Aleichem, it's also Leopold and Zakharmasov, it's also Josef Roth, it's German-speaking writers, it's Yiddish-speaking writers, it's Crimean Tatar writers, it's Polish writers, Stanisław Lem, for example. Importantly within that is the Russian element. I think Ukraine really has to embrace very energetically and reclaim its Russian language culture. And this is extremely important to kind of to counter the idea of the Russian world. Russian language culture belongs to Russia. Ukraine has to stop kind of ignoring its Russian language culture and kind of allowing it to be co-opted by a different political project. And it has to push it. It has to push it at home and abroad. So going from Gogol, things before Gogol, down to Andrei Kokov today, poets like Boris Kuzhansky, there are many contemporary Russian language Ukrainian writers, who need to be taught properly in schools as Ukrainian writers, for example. The third point, Ukraine has to promote its own culture at home. It has to promote Ukrainian culture in the way that, for example, the British Council supports British Council abroad. The Ukrainian state has to promote Ukrainian culture in the south and east of the country as well. But it has to do it in a different way. It has to develop new models for promoting that. It has to modernize the way it presents its culture through education, through other cultural policies. It has to be more appealing. It has to be less about forcing a kind of traditional ethnicized view of the culture onto people, which is how it's received. It has to be more about Hijadan than it is about 19th century methodology. So these are three things that I think would really help Ukraine bridge this gap that I've outlined between the strength of civic national identity that's come up recently and the way that the Ukrainian national culture has still remained quite stagnant.
Plenty of food for thought already, I'm sure. Our next speaker is Francois Guenet, who's a reader in modern Jewish history at UCL Hebrew and Jewish Studies. He's also secretary of the European Association for Jewish Studies. He works on Eastern European Jewish history, mainly on Poland, or in particular on Poland. He's written on anti-Semitism in Poland and Hungary, and his most recent work, the collected volume, will come out in April 2015, and it looks at Warsaw as a Jewish metropolis.
Thank you. I'm taking a certain risk here because I've been terribly under the weather over the past couple of days, and I've not really been able to prepare a proper talk. I fear that I have not a rounded paper to present, and I apologize for that. But I was very happy to receive this invitation to speak to a forum organized by Platform Ukraine, which is such a successful and commendable initiative, and I look forward to future cooperations, I hope, on the topic of Ukrainian Jewish issues. The reason I was asked and why I was very eager to take up this invitation was that I co-organized an event last year through the Institute for Polish Jewish Studies entitled The Jews and the Ukrainian Revolution, Future Perspectives, for which we invited Joseph Wissels from Kiev to speak to a London audience, an event which we held at a friend's house here on Euston Road, and Rachel Harris, my friend, is here in the audience, who had been instrumental in raising the funds in the London Jewish community, and I emphasized the English Jewish community in London, to make this event possible. And we organized this event because what has happened at the Maidan is an event which is a development or a dynamic which is pretty remarkable. Until 2013, the history of the Jews of Ukraine has been dealt with more or less like it has been developing in other countries, other regions of Eastern Europe, Poland, Lithuania, Hungary. This is a very dynamic field in Jewish history, a very dynamic area, and the outcomes are, for example, this very, very important volume of Pauline Studies in Polish Jewry, devoted to the Polish-Ukrainian Jewish triangle, edited by Antony Polonsky and Johannan Piotrowski-Stern from Northwestern University, which, as was the case for other countries before, tackles the whole range of issues of Jewish, non-Jewish cohabitation in Eastern Europe, one which includes history of persecutions in the early modern period, history of partial identification or integration, history of partial acculturation, also linguistic acculturation, but also the emergence of a very strong and assertive Jewish culture which would remain or Yiddish or become Hebrew-speaking and Zionist in the framework of other national movements and so on, but also obviously the history of the Holocaust, history of a very problematic role of local populations in the persecution and murder of their Jewish neighbors, which we have been discussing for Lithuania, Poland a lot, and which is starting to be, or has been started to be looked at in more detail over the past couple of years for the case of Ukraine as well. So if you want to know what is the current state-of-the-art historiographic standard, look up volume 26 of Pauline Studies in Polish Jewry. It's not that expensive, by the way. And you'll have it here. Ukrainian authors, American, Canadian authors, authors of Ukrainian and Ukrainian Jewish origin. Another example, which I cannot stop myself from sharing with you, Yohanan Petrovsky-Stern's most recent monograph, The Golden Age Shtetl, a very empathetic presentation of Jewish identity, not Jewish identity, of Jewish culture in the early 19th century in what is today Ukraine, and which was awarded a few days ago the National Jewish Book Award in the United States in the category of history, which is as high as you can get in public recognition of a work of historiography. It's highly entertaining, and it was my pleasure to read it for Princeton University Press when it was still a manuscript. And Yohanan, a good friend, here shows an alternative understanding of what Eastern European Jewish culture was in Ukraine in the early 19th century. This is a bit just to show that a lot is happening to discuss Ukrainian Jewish identity, of which I have to emphasize I'm not a specialist. My specialization is much more Poland and Poland-related issues. But then happened the Maidan and the way in which Joseph Zisels and many others got involved in this political project we found most fascinating. I would like to take up William's suggestion to reflect on the term of identity and reject it from the start. It's a term which we use if we don't want to say anything. Brubaker has proposed to rather speak about identifications. I think this is a good idea to understand that individuals make choices in specific situations confronted with specific challenges. There is nothing like identity. This is a shortcut, which is just a way to avoid complex explanations of things going on. So when we organized this event last year, I described Joseph Zisels as a Jew in the Ukrainian Revolution, referring to a book by Francis Molino about a Polish Jew in the French Revolution of 1789. Zalkin Horwitz was a major agent in the French Revolution of 1789, and in the same time a major agent of political change in favor of the Jewish community. Joseph Zisels, and I take him as a type of Jewish involvement in the Maidan and all it entails. He's not the only one, I have to emphasize. Indeed, subscribes and identifies with many of the, or most of the objectives of the Maidan, and does this as a Jew. And because he sees the possibilities, the potentials of the Maidan, the rule of law, transparency, fight against corruption, fairness, and so on, as a core prerequisite to let's call it normalize the Jewish situation in Ukraine. Is the situation of the Jews of Ukraine is unnormal? Yes, it is. It is as unnormal as is the existence of any subject of a post-imperial place like Ukraine, part of a nation which is part of a post-imperial space like the Soviet Union, with certain phenomena like, for example, widespread corruption or the existence of extreme discrepancies in wealth. And I'll give you a nice example of that. This is a blog which is called Quartz, and this is a wonderful blog entry about the Jews of Dnipropetrovsk. And this is the rabbi of the community center. Anybody who knows a bit of Jews in Dnipropetrovsk or in Ukraine will have come across an image of the community center. This is the community center of the Jews of Dnipropetrovsk. As a friend journalist of mine told me he took me for my first tour through Warsaw in 1984, and we passed along the Pałac Kultury i Nauki, he said, "Mały, ale pustotny," small but tasteful. So here you have a Jewish community center which is so oversized, so dramatically oversized, such a ridiculous expression of too much money, and spending too much money on something which is probably, I mean, it's good to have a community center and there's nothing to object, right? But this is a 24 or something floor building. What do you do with such a thing for a community of 50,000 Jews? You can house the whole community. So this is one of the non-normalcies of the Ukrainian Jewish community, that you have Jewish oligarchs, we have Jewish and non-Jewish oligarchs in this community, and this has a significant effect. I have still 5 minutes. Oh wow, great.
If you wish to use it.
Well, I will. The most important are obviously Viktor Pinchuk, Gennady Bogolyubov, Igor Kolomoisky, all of which are assessed at $2 to $3 billion today. If you realize what the average income of a household in Ukraine is, Jewish or non-Jewish, this is just obscene money. And it comes out of obscene ways to make money. So oligarchs, Jewish or non-Jewish, have been involved in what you call the raiderstvo, in raiding businesses, in appropriating the economic energy of others, well, I don't go into a rant about oligarchs. The whole thing, if you imagine a family of 5 or 6 people and one wins a lottery and suddenly has £5 million or 10 million pounds, this really distorts the relations. And the Ukrainian Jewish community, which is sustainable, which is deeply rooted, which has a long and proud history, is in a certain way tempted to rely on people who dispose of means which are to beyond anything what the average person can ever achieve in their lives, that it is in a certain way poisoning the relations in the community. So the Jewish understanding of the Maidan, if I look at it from a point of view of Joseph Zisas and people who think like himself, the goal will be to achieve fair power and economic relations in society, and to make Jews a part of that. And Ukraine is probably in a better place than many other nations in Europe, especially today, to realize this. There are very few nations where Jews are as visible in political life as in Ukraine. The number of Jewish members of the Rada is higher than in most other European parliaments. The deputy prime minister is Kreuzmann, or was Kreuzmann. He's now speaker of the Rada. A very assertive Jew, self-assertive Jew. He doesn't hide his Jewishness. And Igor Kolomoisky, who is one of these oligarchs, he's also, as probably many of you know, the governor of the district of Dnipropetrovsk. So if he loses all his money, which won't happen, he still will have a very, very important post in the Ukrainian political system. And this is where the promise of the Maidan lies for Jews as it lies for non-Jews. And this is what also brings Zisels Zisels and others to defend the track record of the Maidan internationally, and to see it as the one way towards a more just society. Is this a dominant view among Jews in Ukraine? Difficult to say, because what is the alternative? The alternative is a post-Soviet Jewish identity, which is very much oriented towards Russian language culture, which has very strong ties to the Russian Federation. And such an alternative understanding of placing Jewish identity in the Eastern European space, in the Ukrainian-Russian space, is also expressed on an institutional basis. You have a very strong confrontation between the VAG, the Association of Communities and Associations of Jews in Ukraine, headed by Zisels, and you have the Federation of the Jewish Confederation of Ukraine, headed by Boris Fuchsman, who is very clearly not in favor of the government in Kiev. And both, for example, confront each other when there is a meeting, like in September 2014 in Berlin, when there is a meeting of the World Jewish Congress. Then one speaks for his understanding of a Jewish potential, of a Jewish perspective in Ukraine, and the other speaks for the other. It's very difficult to say what will be the outcome of that. This depends also obviously of the military situation. And I should add that immigration, especially from the areas of military confrontation, is significant. It's an immigration which is a flight to the west of the country, it's a flight to the Russian Federation, and it's also immigration. 6,000 Jewish families immigrated from Ukraine last year, double of the number who emigrated in 2013. So the immigration of Jews from one of the largest Jewish communities in Europe is accelerating, and all depends from the security situation whether this will accelerate or not. I share one more picture with you because it's just too nice. These are two metal workers, two Jewish entrepreneurs who build stoves for the Ukrainian army, stoves for ovens, stove for soldier tents, and they call this stove nitzachon, which is Hebrew for victory, which is a very nice. This is not about identity. This is about the combining of visions, right? We support the Ukrainian army with we endow them with something like a blessing. One final word, because of the talk given yesterday by Tim Snyder, who warned that the main target of Russian policies right now is not the Ukraine but Europe. This is something which we probably have to discuss. What the perspectives are for Ukraine in Europe, because of what Europe will become. For the Jews of Ukraine, Europe is something which is discussed also from a different point of view. Jews also start to leave the rest of Europe. Jews start to leave France. Jews start to leave the United Kingdom because Western Europe is not really able to provide a sufficient secure surrounding for their existence. So for the Jews of Ukraine, the Western European ideal has a certain different sound to it than for others, probably. Thank you very much.
One of the fantastic things about Platform Ukraine events is that it brings together scholars and experts from a variety of fields and disciplines, and today is no exception. So it's my pleasure to introduce the next speaker, who is Piotr Binder, who is assistant professor at the Institute of Philosophy and Sociology at the Polish Academy of Sciences and is currently a visiting postdoctoral fellow here at CIS, UCL. His most recent publication is on youth and poverty, so looking at coping strategies of young people in post-collective state forms in Russia and Poland. And today he'll be speaking about attitudes towards Ukrainians among Poles in Ukrainian-Polish borderlands.
Thank you. And thank you very much for the invitation. Here in CIS, I deal with project on Polish, Russian and Polish Ukrainian borderlands. Over today I'll focus on Polish attitudes of Poles towards Ukrainians, which I'm afraid tells more about their identity, if there is any identity, than Ukrainian one. But still, I will refer to at least a couple of subjects that were already mentioned. I will quickly provide you the structure of this short talk. I will have to mention a couple of words about the methodology just in order to make it clear, and the social demographics. I will discuss the general chances in the attitude of Poles towards other nations, and particularly Poland's neighbors, and then I'll focus on attitude towards Ukrainians and the changes that we noticed over the past 2 decades. The data, it comes from the very good research center that functions for only 1 year. It's independent. They provide good quality data. It is all available online. Some of it was translated in English in the reports, so you can easily get access to it. It started in 1993 with 17 nations and developed gradually into 36 by this year, and I have the results for this year already. The research was conducted in January, and by February it was already available. And they were using for the data I'm referring to positive negative attitude. They were using 7-point scale, -3 to +3, with 0 as the middle point, and the data was merged. Social demographics, what was important there? As usually was level of education. So what we should differentiate the data internally. The higher education positively correlates with positive attitude, as you might suspect, but not as much as with negative attitude. So it doesn't really matter if you study, if you are university graduate, it doesn't really mean you will express negative attitude towards other nation. This material status positively correlates with lower income. Age, negatively, the younger they are, they're more open and positively react to other nations. Place of living, obviously, rural and urban areas, and religious practices. In Poland, it is also this regional factor that is very important, because in the region of the Polish-Ukrainian borderlands, people are very much more sensitive to these issues, whereas in the northeast, Warmia and Mazuria, due to many factors, somehow communist regime managed to create some sort of multicultural space where people got used to the fact that there are people of other roots and habits and traditions and get along with this quite well. Now, I'll start with this. Don't worry, it's the most messy graph, but I'll do that on purpose in order to show you the general trends. Why? Because as you can observe on this graph, Poles generally express more positive attitudes towards most of the nations, including Ukrainians, over the past 20 years, but excluding Russians, for example, which we will notice in a minute. Generally, Poles express positive attitudes towards the nations of the West. I did not include it here for obvious reasons. It's already plenty of data on one graph, but you can see Czech. It's in orange. They're an exception. They're one of our neighbors. They're located south of Poland, and Poles simply like them a lot. But this is this level of positive attitude that Poles express towards most of the old EU countries. These are the countries they like, accept, they aspire, they want to be like them. That's the positive reference point. On the other hand, Poles who like to distance themselves from the countries of the East. And you can see there's this group of Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine. There's Lithuania recently as well, and they don't really like to be associated with this group of countries. This is a negative point of reference for many reasons. The standard of living, among other things. You can easily notice that if you pay attention to this somehow obvious details that Poles, and this applies probably to the entire group of visitor countries, they refer to themselves as Central Europe, not the Eastern Europe. There is CEU University in Budapest, Central European University, it's not Eastern European University. And that's for a reason. Here you have only the neighbors of Poland, and you can observe how the positive, as I focus on that, attitude was changing over time. And if we would like to analyze the attitude towards Ukrainians only, for obvious reasons, again, we would have to take into account our history, and it's very, very traumatic and complicated. And what is even worse, it's the fact that it was not worked on for years, for decades. There was no room for that. Under the communist regime, it was an unexistent topic. There was no academic debate, there was no public debate, and it didn't happen also after the 1989. In terms of relations with the Germans, we started quite early, we were quite successful. You can see here, there's Germany, and that's the beginning, that's cold. That's the period when they did very good job. When it decreases, that's already Erika Steinbach, and it's getting complicated again. In case of Polish-Jewish relations and relations with Jewish community and the whole historical experience, this debate, I think, at least has started. It's ongoing debate, and at least it's there. People do that. They publish, they discuss, it's being present constantly. When it comes to Polish-Ukrainian common history. It's extremely difficult. And we didn't do this in the past, and we didn't really do a great job in recent years either. When President Kwasniewski was in office for 2 terms, they were keeping really close relations with Ukraine, but one of the tricks was not to really touch the subject. So they were aware it exists, but there was no real progress in that. So the question of what is being described by Polish historians as massacres in Volhynia and Eastern Galicia is still unsolved. It is there, and that's where the generally very negative stereotype of Ukrainians is deeply rooted. There we talk about the Ukrainian insurgent army that generally has highly negative connotations in Polish context, and that's why even at the very beginning of the night, as you can see, those are basically the dynamics of the process is pretty similar. But up to 2004, the Ukrainians were always slower than Belarusians and Russians. Not to mention the fact that Poles very often confuse them. I mean, nowadays not as much as in the past, but due to the fact that they speak the same language, they all come from the former Soviet Union, look alike, they couldn't really tell the difference. And it was, again, we could check that in the research, in the interviews, for example, conducted after the IDIs, after the opinion polls were done. Now, this brings us to the role of the current events. Here what you have is a dramatic jump in the positive attitudes towards Ukrainians. And it could be said that it's not that high because it was plus 10% in positive attitudes towards Ukrainians and minus 17% in negative ones. Here it is, it's just Ukrainians, and you have the positive attitudes and the decrease of negative attitudes. But we have to remember that those attitudes are based on stereotypes, and stereotypes are very much deeply rooted. So it's very difficult to change them. Now, next thing is, as you can see, during the dramatic events of the Euromaidan, the change was not that significant. It was only plus 5% on the positive side and minus 1 of the negative attitude. Why? And this question is complicated as the picture of the Ukrainian community develops and diversifies in Polish society, and that happens for many reasons. I will touch upon only a couple of elements that we have to include into our thinking while we consider this process. And one, whereas in 2004, Poles enthusiastically supported Ukrainians to the extent that never happened before. It was outrageous, it was tremendous support. The people were going there in groups, everybody was there. I was there, I was working there at the time, but this way I could observe it. Now it's more and more, and it's more moderate. There are two basic processes. One, Poles do not feel safe for themselves anymore, and 75% of the Poles perceive the situation in Ukraine as a threat to the security of Poland. And what is even worse, although they support alliances like NATO, Over a third of them agreed that Poland cannot be confident if the NATO allies will get involved in defense of Polish borders if it's needed. The other thing is the situation, the current situation, after Euromaidan situation is not as clear as it was. At the time it was bad Victor and the good Victor, and we knew whom to support. And now it got very much confusing because there were all those groups on Maidan, and although we are somehow vaccinated as a nation, like we heard yesterday during the Professor Snyder's lecture, Poles don't buy Russian propaganda. I think it's true. We produce propaganda of our own. We support Ukrainians enthusiastically. In the mainstream media, generally mainstream media is pro-Ukrainian. We don't ask difficult questions if they exist, just in order not to confuse the general public even more. But we are not as enthusiastic as we were at the time, 10 years ago. There is third element, it's history, there is the current events, and there's also personal experiences of contacts with Ukrainians. In the past, like at the beginning of the transformation, I mean, we knew there is some sort of Ukrainian minority in Poland. Of course, there was this action Wisła, the big relocation of Ukrainian minority, but it was small, they were dispersed, nobody knew about them. Now this community is growing. And I'll provide you just with one fact. We don't know how many Ukrainians are in Poland at all. We don't have a clue. Officially, we have that's the data for 2013. Officially, we had like 200,000 Ukrainian workers registered in Poland. Now, back in 2009, we introduced this local border traffic. There's this zone of 30 kilometers. There's simplified procedures. People can move back and forth. So, on the border, and that's the data of the Polish border guards, there were only in 2013, there was 12 million border crossings. I have a suspicion that some of those people do not follow the procedures and go back home immediately when they have to. Especially that Poles have generally show good attitude towards them. They like to employ them. They feel better about themselves because there are people that are actually coming to Poland in order to find an employment. Whereas in the past, we were the nation that was traveling all across the world, as you know from Zanetsky and Thomas, in order to make money for another cow or a piece of land. So that's an element that we have to include into our analysis. It's just there is no good data on this that I could possibly refer to. So, briefly conclusions. Poles generally express more positive attitudes towards most of the nations, including Ukrainians. It changes, and we can support that with the data illustrated. Poles generally clearly prefer nations of the West, and at the same time, they do not want to be associated with the East anyhow. If we could build a wall. I mean, probably there would be a door for Ukrainians, but generally, we do not want to be part of the other side. It's like we've never been there. Now, when the case of the attitude of Poles towards Ukrainians is being analyzed, the three elements have to be taken into consideration. There are strong stereotypes and burden of history, and that is something we need to work on. And the sooner we start, the better for everybody. I mean, in the form of public debate, academic debate, publications, whatever it takes, it should be done. It should be going on. There are current events and how they develop that we have to take into account in order to understand why we, as Poles, why they do not express this level of enthusiasm they did 10 years ago. And also, there is this element of this new element of the Polish context is this huge growing group of migrant workers that somehow surprising to many people integrate without
difficulty. Culturally, in terms of language, habits, religion even, they integrate easily. So that must influence the perception of Ukrainians as a nation, because nobody thinks of his hairdresser of Nani as a perpetrator from the past. I mean, they do not associate them with this difficult history. They do not think, there is this stereotype of those murderous Ukrainians from the past that killed all those thousands, tens of thousands of Poles in Volodya. So that works in Plastant, I think. And the last thing I'm gonna say, there is this potential inflow that might happen of Ukrainian refugees. If the situation is getting worse, it might. If there is an open conflict, we don't know that yet. But what we do know is that Poland as a country is absolutely not prepared for that. We do not have procedures, we do not have the capacities, we are not prepared at all. And on the national level, our officials admitted that. So we have documents for that when they say we are not prepared. And they provide examples of countries like Bulgaria or Turkey, who experienced this big inflow of people from Syria. And that might very much work in minus regard, in regard to the attitudes towards Ukrainians. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Piotr. On that, one of the last extremely important points that Piotr mentioned, working on stereotypes and prejudices and that the difficult shared history, I just wanted to, with permission of Platform Ukraine organizers, to advertise an event that's going to take place at Sea soon on the 19th of March. And that will be a screening of a film by Wanda Koszcza, My Friend the Enemy. And this film, a documentary film, explores the Volhynian massacre of 1943 in a very unusual and extremely interesting new way. So you're all very welcome to attend the event and to see the film, and Wanda will be present at the event, so you'll be able to talk to her directly. Okay, so moving on, this might take me a little while to introduce our next speaker. Anna Shevchenko is the CEO of 3CN, which is a consultancy specializing in cross-cultural risk management and conflict resolution. Anna speaks 7 languages. She has lived in 32 countries. She has interpreted for 4 British prime ministers and provided cross-cultural advice to 2 of them. In September 2014, she returned to the UK after spending 6 months on the Foreign Office secondment as deputy head of the Kyiv office of the OSCE Special Monitoring Mission in Ukraine. Anna managed a team of international experts from 24 countries, the experts who monitored the issues of security, human rights, political and economic analysis and criminal justice. She was involved in the ceasefire OSCE Ukraine-Russian group talks. Her team members were also the first of the among the responders to the MH17 plane crash site, and were involved in the border monitoring. Anna received an MPhil degree from Cambridge. There she researched cross-cultural attitudes to conflict. She is a visiting lecturer at a number of different academic institutions. I won't, with your permission, will list all of them right now. But Anna's also the author of numerous articles and 4 books, and her 2 multi-award winning political thrillers, The Bequest and The Game, are now published in over 20 countries. Anna, over to you.
And after all this, I'm not going to talk about anything that you mentioned. Well, first of all, thank you very much, Platform Ukraine, for inviting me. I know that, thank you, Kaneshko, you tried several times, but I simply couldn't because I was traveling and still travel quite a lot. And I was going to talk today about a very simple thing about identity and conflict. I'm not a researcher, I'm very much a practitioner, and I wanted to mention several things that I observed. But perhaps it's also worth saying that 10 years ago I was asked to write a book about Ukrainian identity. To get into the Culture Smart series, first ever time, they decided to use Ukraine as a country, and I thought, fantastic, great, with my last name Shevchenko, what can be better? So I started researching it, flew to Kiev, went into the largest bookshop and said, where is the shelf with the books on Ukrainian identity? And of course the answer was, there aren't any. And I said, what do you mean, where is the shelf with the books on Ukrainian identity? And the answer was, well, nobody's interested, so why should we keep them? Okay? This year I came to the same shop and said, where are the books on Ukrainian identity? And they showed me the wall. So that was quite an interesting one. But I wanted to start with asking you, how many of you went to Kamenets Podilsk? Apart from Olga, who of course knows a little bit. Yes, and of course you, yeah, three people, but who will tell you all about this wonderful city. But I think, and of course your grandfather was from there, wasn't he? Yeah, like mine. But why I ask that is that if you've got a chance, please visit this place, not only because it's a wonderful UNESCO heritage site, but because this, for me, is the model of Ukrainian identity. Because in the middle of this wonderful old city, you have a Catholic Polish cathedral with the minaret of a mosque built in. That stands on the Ruska street with the Armenian gate and the Jewish gate on both sides of that street. And all that is over the precipice, on the edge. And to get to Poland, which is so nearby, you have to cross this massive precipice on that edge. And that for me is the symbol of Ukrainian identity on the crossroads. That is the country that always amalgamated on the crossroads all these incredible identities. So how did the country react? How did all these identities react during the conflict? I've spent 2 very interesting months wandering around the Maidan from tent to tent, talking to various people there. And of course the first most obvious thing in the conflict is, how do you recognize this division between us and them? How do you recognize the enemy and how do you recognize a friend? So symbols become very important. But what I found was very interesting, that symbols can be, patriotic symbols, first of all, of course, are the part of recognition of us and them, but also they became a shield, very much a shield, because people feel more protected if they become part of the group. And that manifested itself in very interesting and sometimes quite amusing situations. The most amusing situation I could think of was a visit to the largest, I think they got into the Guinness Book of Records, the largest embankment which was painted as a Ukrainian flag on the beach in the world. And when we visited that embankment and they proudly showed us this painted flag, the whole beach in bikinis stood up, and it wasn't the rehearsal, they all stood up in bikinis and sang the Ukrainian anthem. And that for me was probably the most bizarre, impulsive, expression of national identity. But it's important to understand that it wasn't, whilst on the Maidan, it was the symbol of us and them. There it was very much a shield or a protection. There was another very interesting, for me, sort of expression of symbolism in conflict, of national identity, which becomes quite confusing. And again, I'll tell you a story of the notorious Pravy Sector, which everybody knows, was a scaremonger, a scarecrow everywhere. And our team's monitors observed a very interesting situation at the Maidan, the main square, where Pravy Sector, whom everybody said were fascist, militants, masked men, set up a stall, and they set up a stall to have a weekend chat with the pensioners, to explain to the pensioners what they're all about, and to explain to them that they're actually peaceful, they want to protect them, and that was one stall. And next to them, there was a stall of a religious sect of Yarila-san, which was very much sort of half-pagan, old sect, which was extremely militant. Okay? And that for me was sort of a very interesting sort of shift of symbolism and identity. And needless to say that we were standing there watching, and one of the monitors said, I give them 5 minutes. No, I'll give them 20 minutes. And of course, we don't know who attacked who first, the sect or the private sector, but it ended up in a brawl. It had police, machine guns. It was quite an exciting thing to watch, actually, but it was a very interesting sort of shift in identity and symbolism. Very interesting sort of manifestations of national identity suddenly we found in the architecture. People started painting fences and bridges, and started first as a very sort of symbolic gesture, and ended up with dozens, and I mean dozens of kids standing on crossroads in different cities in Ukraine, asking for money for paint. And I asked the driver, I said, are you sure they will really use it for paint? Is it all a fake? Is it all some sort of a con? No, let the kids paint. Let the kids paint. And that for me was extraordinary, that several cities we visited, you can see all these sort of, it's as if that was this invisible chair or invisible sort of desire to protect. That's again sort of this protection thing, during the conflict. And even now, when you go somewhere, you will see all these painted fences, bridges all over Ukraine. So that was very much about symbolism. There was something I wanted to mention, which will be controversial. I was criticized for this in Ukraine, but I still think that, for me, I still will hold this view, and that is that partly Putin's plan A failed because there was a misunderstanding of Ukrainian identity, cultural identity as such, and I'll try to explain what I mean. Russian mentality, or mentality rather, not even identity, I have to be very careful with words here. Russian mentality is built on a vertical. Yeah, it's very strictly a vertical order. Yes, they have the idea without it. So you had it's very strictly sort of very strict vertical orders, obedience, etc. Ukrainian mentality, especially rural mentality, is built on the small holding mentality, хуторской mentality. I had barrage, of comments, why are you calling us sort of villages? We are not villages, we are not corpus. That's a sociological term, yeah? Small holding, хуторской mentality. What does it mean? It's actually the Ireland, Irish, Lithuanians, Ukrainians, Portuguese have all this mentality. It's a mentality which means that people can self-organize and actually survive in a small group and not be afraid, a very tough group. And that's what happened during the conflict. The people started self-organizing, and Putin said, right, I will do my classic bribe, dash, intimidation thing. And everything, he thought, was agreed at the top. But nobody expected this self-organizing Russian. And I always have slight skepticism to civil society, which sometimes is funded by different funds. But I can honestly tell you, after 6 months in Ukraine, I've never seen anything like it, anywhere in the world, like this civil society self-organizing in Ukraine. Talking about identity, I really agree with your observation about cultural identity and civic identity. Really, really very important to see that it was very much the civic identity rather than this rural sort of Vyshyvanki identity. But self-organization was key, and it's still quite interesting. However, Chekhov famously said, every idiot can manage the crisis, which I always thought when I was at OSC, think of that phrase, but every idiot can manage the crisis, it's much harder to live the real life. So what happens now? What happens, if after the crisis, all this embroidery parades or, the bikini anthem singing, what happens then? Particularly with 1 million IDPs, displaced people all over Ukraine. And there are pluses and minuses in IDPs. Everybody would say it's tragedy, not always. I've seen a number of cases, and our monitors reported a number of cases when people from very deprived or tragic circumstances in eastern Ukraine would go to Lviv or Ternopil and feel welcome, and actually would not want to go back. So this sort of mixture, floods and support, that is a very positive thing. However, there are also dramatic negative things about things like, I'll give you a very small example, where we came to the village where the village kicked out all the IDPs because of one phrase of one child who came to play with their children and said, "My father will be back soon, he'll kill all your fathers and we'll go home." Okay? So there is this, of course, this risk in internal displacement of all this tragedy that remains. And how to deal with that in conflict, how to deal with that identity, I think that is very much a challenge. I could talk for hours, but I probably would stop here because there's a lot to say. Okay?
Excellent. Okay, thank you very much. We've got plenty of time for discussion, more than half an hour. What I'd like to ask you to do is to introduce yourself, if you don't mind, and keep your comments and your questions brief. So more of us can voice the views and the questions. I will take questions in clusters, maybe of 3, and we'll work in that way. So, any questions? Please.
Yeah, I was actually for the first speaker, for William, because you said that Ukraine is one of the actually good countries for the community, and I was wondering what can you say about Russia? Is it the same good country for Jewish community or no? If I confuse you with the sorry. I'm so sorry. Yeah, I was to you, sorry.
Okay.
Yeah, so
Shall we
sorry.
take 2 more questions? Yeah? More questions? Any more? Yes, please.
Yeah, I was a bit surprised. I am Olga Kerikova, and I'm curator of Ukrainian collections in the British Library. I was a bit surprised by Piotr saying that too little was done for Ukrainian-Polish reconciliation. I lived all these years believing that quite a lot was done, that every year Ukrainian and Polish historians met and discussed and published a journal called Ukraina Polska Trudne Pytania, and they published and published and published. Even they came to London and gave there was very good meeting with Ukrainian community and with Polish community. So during the last 20 years, a lot was done for Ukrainian and Polish reconciliation. The only volume which was not published, they published 2 volumes, was about Volhynia. All other volumes were one volume, Polish and Ukrainian historians. They could not agree only about one subject, which is 1943. So I am a bit surprised. The question is probably the situation is not so good.
Thank you.
If our meeting, even at Lviv during the public publishers forum, I was present when Polish historians were speaking in Polish, Ukrainian, and Ukrainians, and the dialogue was going constantly, and it's still going on. So probably you can say a bit more about these vital things that you have not done.
Are there any more questions? Yes, please.
My question is kind of to all the panelists. So, if we consider like worldview as part of one's identity, no matter how identity is a controversial term, what would you say about people who have been brainwashed and just offered one just worldview through Russian media, Russian propaganda, and then the result is that they do not choose to be with Russia, they just have one worldview and they don't have like the alternative of Europe because they just don't imagine, and the way it's constructed is completely wrong and non-objective and biased. So how would you cope with identities that were artificially imposed? And since then the political expression is very like dangerous and disruptive for Ukrainian
Should we start with you
Yeah.
as well? Yeah.
Thank you for the question. It's me. Which allows me actually to address a point which I think is very important, namely the specific place of the Jewish community in a polity in the Commonwealth depends very much on the self-image of this community, of the Commonwealth, and also of the Jewish community. The Soviet Union was a place of much trouble for the Jews, but it also was the nation which saved the Jews from annihilation. It was the nation which emancipated the Jews in 1917 after a very long fight for emancipation in the Russian Empire and the Tsarist Empire, and allowed for an unheard of social and cultural advance over the next 20 years until the sharp break under Stalin. But still you have a massive metropolization of the Russian Jewish community. You have a tremendous educational success. You have a deep and heartfelt identification with Russian literature, Russian music, what Yuri Styotskin has termed Pushkin Jews. Pushkin Jews who identify with Russian cultural heritage at least as much as the average urban educated Russian Orthodox elite. And this is something you don't take away from a community. And this is obviously something which has deeply impregnated the Ukrainian Jewish community. The Ukrainian Jewish community is obviously one which is part of a post-Soviet world which has a lot of intake from the Soviet Union. And this is not all negative, certainly not. It is, and there's one thing I didn't address, and thank you for your question because it allows me to do so. There is a very important generational shift. The older generations obviously are much stronger identifying with such a vision of a Eastern European Jewish identity, which has a strong orientation towards the great achievements of Russian culture, and doesn't see a real reason why not to, because Pushkin is beautiful, right? And because the Red Army did liberate Auschwitz, and because the Soviet Union, for good or for bad, was a place where anti-Semitism, at least on the facade of the system, was not an option. And all that is pretty convincing for quite a number of people. So there's, yeah, it works. Let's put it that way. And this is much less convincing for a younger generation, which is identifying, or which is orientating itself, following a different set of values and strives for other things. And I would like to follow up on one thing Anna talked about, namely symbolism. And I would like to challenge the identity, or to identify symbolism of something and identity. The flag, my perception of this ubiquity of the Ukrainian flag, which we have seen over the past year. I wasn't there, but I saw it following events on Twitter and everywhere, that suddenly you have this Ukrainian flag everywhere. And for me, the Ukrainian flag is the tricolor. It is very much like the French, like the flag of the French Revolution. It is not an ethno-national identification which is expressed through this flag, but a political choice. And this is a very significant. It's not something like Ukrainian identity, but it is the political transformation which is encapsulated in the Maidan. And because the flag is a very good shortcut, it is one of the reasons why it is. That was my perception of it. I may be wrong. Why the flag suddenly is such a popular way to express adhering to the ideals of the Maidan.
Yes.